Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Nuances and Importance of the Military Affidavit in the Collection Process. I am Amy Poggi-Marsh, the Construction and Collection Services Groups Manager here at NCS, and today I'm joined by Mr. Roy Kaufman. Roy serves as the Director of the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act Centralized Verification Service, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Roy, and thank you for joining us today.
A pleasure being here.
Now let's get started. Here's the agenda for today's webinar. What is the affidavit? When is the affidavit required? What should be done when the affidavit is received? Why is the affidavit essential to the collection process? And how to comply with the due diligence requirements under the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act. And finally, resources available for compliance. Let's first define the affidavit. As you can see from this slide, the affidavit is a sworn statement proving the defendant is not an active service member. So why is that important? Well, when a service member is active, the individual may be out of the country and will not have the ability to defend themselves in litigation. Also, it's worth mentioning that the document has various names depending on the jurisdiction, such as a Certificate of Non-Military Service, a Non-Military Affidavit, or the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act Affidavit, just to name a few. Now, when does the Certificate of Non-Military Service come into play? Well, first the defendant has to be an individual. And if there's money owed or some other adverse action that needs to be taken. This would include, but is not limited to, filing suit in pursuit of judgment and the other issues that are mentioned on this slide as well. Now, the creditor has to do a couple things upon receiving the affidavit. First, the creditor must confirm the debtor is not an active service member and then execute the document accordingly. In executing the affidavit, the creditor is confirming that they have done their due diligence in verifying if an individual is an active service member. Now, at this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Roy, and he will discuss some of the finer points of the affidavit.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Looking at the slide, let's first understand what the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act is. It is a law, it used to have a name of the Soldiers and Sailors Act of 1948, and its goal was basically to protect those who are serving the country and basically insulate them from the headaches that might arise from collections and other adverse action that are happening at home. The revision of that law, which is totally revised under the name Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, expanded those protections, and as Amy mentioned, some of those protections involve protections against default judgments, and that's the purpose and the goal of our webinar for today. Very often when people are sued, they don't participate in the lawsuit, and the lawyer's next step then is to go to court and ask for a default judgment. A default judgment is where it's asking the court to rubber stamp or to approve the complaint, to enter a judgment against the defendant so that the plaintiff is then able to take collections action like garnishments, attachments on bank accounts, taking possession of real estate, storage lockers, and things along those lines. In order to get the default judgment, the law clearly says, the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act clearly says that there has to be some due diligence done and a writing provided by the plaintiff that indicates whether or not the defendant is in military service, or if the plaintiff just cannot determine that, a statement to the effect that we just can't figure out whether he's in the military or not. In the latter case, very often the courts will stop the proceedings and require the posting of a bond, and that bond will have to stay in the registry of the court until an appeal is taken and fully decided upon. And I had mentioned a writing. This writing can be in the form of a certificate, it can be a declaration, it can be a verification. It has all those different names that Amy had mentioned, but the key is it has to be sworn to under penalty of perjury. That's really the key. So there's no real special form of this document. We'll talk about the alternate possibilities. Next slide, please, Amy. let's take a look at what an affidavit looks at. On the left is really an affidavit, and on the right is a blow-up for you. And I'm just going to go over some of these letters that I've handwritten here to illustrate certain points that are necessary in the written proof. Number one, or excuse me, letter B is a tracking number. Whenever you ask for a verification of a military service from our organization, which we'll introduce ourselves to shortly, we give each individual name a tracking number. And that's just an internal number so that you can inquire about that verification request anytime you want. The active duty status date, which is in letter A, that is the date that you're searching. So for example, if you want to know if the person is in the military now, you normally would leave that blank on our site, and it would automatically fill in today's date. Rarely, and very rarely, you might want to know whether the person was in the military service in the past. And that can also be done by just putting in a different active duty status date. By definition, of course, you can't put in a status date that's in the future because nobody can tell whether the person is in the military or not in the future. But the ADSD, the active duty status date, is the key because it is of that snapshot in time we will be telling you whether the person is in the military or not. We will not tell you, for example, whether he was in the military, over a period of time, but just as of a snapshot in time. Going into the, if you look at letter C, that refers you back and says, yes, we're certifying as of this particular date what the status is. In D, let me refer you to the DMDC, which is the Department of Defense Manpower Data Center. That is a branch of the United States government, and that is the computer the computer database, which basically is supposed to keep track of all military personnel. That database can be contacted directly by creditors, in theory, really only if you have the Social Security number. If you don't have the Social Security number, there are some problems with the responses they give to you, and we'll go over those problems, what we call the disclaimers that judges frown upon. And again, in E, you'll see this is the word subscribed and sworn to. These are the requirements under the law that says that the document has to be done under penalty of perjury. Okay, very well. Now, the Service Member Civil Relief Act is a federal statute. It applies to all governmental jurisdictions within the United States, our District of Columbia, etc. There are sometimes situations where the individual states pass their own versions in addition to the federal version, where they give more protections. So I'm going to give you some suggestions that certain states require different wording in their affidavits. Usually our affidavits are universal, but we have learned that some jurisdictions want this special wording. So if you order a jurisdiction for Texas or New York, it'll have special wording. If you're going to order an affidavit for the District of Columbia, it's a completely different form, but generally 90% of the time it is the same form across the country. Examples of these state mandated additional wording might be, for Texas, it asks that you have to say that the affiant is older than 18 years old. The affiant is the person who's signing the affidavit. Other states require that the affidavit has to say that it's based on the affiant's personal knowledge, and others ask for the basis of that knowledge. But if you order the affidavit from us, we will tailor it to your particular state. And if for some reason we have missed your state or you have a problem, you just let us know and we will immediately issue a corrective affidavit, and henceforth we would make sure that affidavits for that jurisdiction conform. Now there's some discussion about the authority of who signs this affidavit. Generally, these affidavits are signed by the lawyers who are prosecuting cases, but they can be signed by the plaintiff itself, the party that's seeking the judgment, the agent of the plaintiff, including the lawyer or an employee of the servicer. We mentioned that the affidavit is under penalty of perjury. SCRA-CVS, that's our organization, the Centralized Verification Service, that's the CVS at the end. We can usually avoid that. There are many attorneys that will not sign the SCRA affidavits for fear of liability, things along those lines. They will shove that responsibility back to the creditor and servicers likewise. You do eliminate a lot of that confusion if you just get the affidavit from us, because we are able to say that by our own personal knowledge we have checked and these are the results, rather than somebody else signing and saying that on second hand that they know that the person is not in the military because they contracted CVS to do the verification. The affidavit has to be done after a creditor has conducted due diligence. When I use the word creditor, it's broad. It means the bank, it means the credit union, it means the servicers who are hired by any of those organizations. So somebody has to exercise due diligence, and it's never really been defined. There have been a couple lawsuits about what constitutes due diligence. I will tell you parenthetically that certainly using our service is going to be a complete satisfaction of the requirement of due diligence. But let's talk about what that due diligence could be if you didn't use us, for example. If you know the Social Security number of the individual, certainly an inquiry directly to DMDC would be required. If you don't know the Social Security number, one of the advantages our organization as a service provider can bring to you is that we can usually find the Social Security numbers if you supply different information, additional information, like, for example, date of birth, addresses, phone numbers, names of relatives, things that you're probably already fairly familiar with in the skip tracing situation. Another way that you could find out if the person is in the military or not and satisfy the due diligence requirement is to ask the individual and say, are you in the military? If you are still on speaking terms with the individual, and then you can usually supply an affidavit to the court, and the court will usually accept it and just say the person himself told me he's not in the military. That should satisfy my due diligence requirement, and it would be up to the individual local judge to determine whether that satisfies it. Last thing is age of individual. Almost under no circumstances are people in the active military over the age of 67. And therefore, that's one of the criteria you could use to satisfy the due diligence requirement. So you would just tell the judge the guy is over 67 years old, and here's the statute that indicates that nobody over 67 is really in active military duty. Then the court can take judicial notice that the person is not in the military. But coming back full circle, if you use a service provider like ours, CVS, you really have satisfied the due diligence requirement. What are they looking for in this service member's affidavit? First of all, we talked about there may be some special wording that the local state requires in the affidavit. If you do not have that Social Security number, there could be some problems in the affidavit which involve a disclaimer. And we'll go into the next slide and we'll talk about some of these disclaimers right now. This is a status report that comes from the DMDC, which is the Government Department of Defense database. And we use this status report, by the way, to create our affidavits. So let's look at a status report that we would get and that you can get if you have the Social Security numbers. First of all, you see the last name, the first name at the top left of the blow-up, the active duty status date we were talking about before. And this is somebody who has a common last name. The name here is John Smith. And we didn't have the Social Security number. We only provided the date of birth. Look what the response is. You see the first arrow says this is the language making the certificate unusable. It just says that there are many records. DMDC can't say whether the individual is on active duty or not, so it's completely unusable. Lower below, you will see the all caps language by that second arrow, which says that the above is our answer, but since you didn't supply a Social Security number, we're not guaranteeing, we're not standing behind this report. You know that the only unique identifier we use is Social Security number, accept this for whatever it's worth. And we're going to use, that is basically the disclaimer that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later. Now here is an unusual last name. Okay, I just spelt the name P-L-U-U-U-U-S, first name John. And again, I did not put in a Social Security number. So here they're saying, if you look at the certificate itself rather than the blow-up a little bit behind it, it says active duty status date NA, active duty end date NA, status no NA. that basically will be a signal that the person is not in the military. What they're telling you is there is nobody with that name and that date of birth in their database that would indicate that the person was an active military service. But you also then have this disclaimer. They're saying again, since you didn't have the Social Security number, you can accept this for whatever it's worth, but we're not guaranteeing it. And this is the kind of disclaimer that judges don't like. Very often the judge will reject the affidavit with this kind of a disclaimer, saying, well, if they're not going to guarantee it, why should I accept it as gospel that the person is in the military or not? And then your lawyer is back to the drawing board. You've lost all of the momentum. He has to go back and he has to get an affidavit without this disclaimer with a certificate. And you have lost time, you've lost money, and you've lost momentum. So we always suggest that if you don't have the Social Security number, you do use a service provider just to keep the case moving along and to avoid problems like you can see. There are ways besides us to get compliance. For example, you could conceivably write to the various branches. The branches of the government that in which a person may be serving would be not only Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, etc., but could also include commissioned officers in the Public Health Service and commissioned officers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. These are uniform-wearing service members, and they are entitled to the protections of the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act. So you could write a letter to each one of those 7 agencies and include a check for $5.40 to each and hope for the best. But I will tell you that would be a complete waste of time. Why would that be? Those are the addresses, for example, that you could write to. Why? Because the Army has said categorically they do not process these. They don't have the manpower to process it. So what you'll do is you will have a uncashed check sitting in your bank account ad infinitum, and you will not have any response from the Army upon which you could base your claim for due diligence. So it's probably not an advisable way to do it. Interestingly enough, if you take that $5.40 times those 7 agencies and you multiply it, you get $36.40, which is exactly the charge that we have for a service member certification. So if anybody's wondering why we come up with that weird number, it is because that's what you would pay out of pocket if you decided to write to each and every agency on your own. The advantages to using a service provider, such as SCRA-CDS, is not only that we can find Social Security numbers, that's our forte, but we also handle large quantities of service member inquiries. We have the retail version of our service for people who just once in a while need to verify military service. But we also have what we call batch or wholesale operations, where people submit to us large databases, sometimes well in excess of 30,000 names at a time, and ask us to run verifications of all of those. And that it becomes a very smooth automated procedure. After it's set up, you're almost not touching it. You're sending a file, it's processed. We send the same file that you send back to you. The only change is that we will have deleted the Social Security number. All batch services require Social Security numbers. We will have deleted the Social Security number, and we will have given you back those data fields that we needed to put in. For example, whether the person is in the military, the agency that he is with, when he has started, and when he has stopped. And let's review 1 second. Service members' protections do not just end when the person leaves the military. Some of those protections extend for an additional 90 days afterwards. So the date of termination of service becomes very important. You can't just stop reading in the middle of the affidavit. If I say to you, this person is retired, and he has a retirement date of September 2014, you have to count very carefully whether the 90 days have gone by or not to determine whether the person still enjoys his military protections under SCRA. Once you get the data file back, the lenders or the servicers are able to incorporate that data right into their database. So you don't necessarily have two separate databases floating around. You have our information right in your database, and many of our very large national banks enjoy this because the level of integration and the level of automation, as well as the level of security, are the factors that they're really looking for. We, and only we, hand out affidavits. When you order a service member's verification at the retail level, you will get an email reply. The timing is usually within 15 minutes if you have the Social Security number, and by the end of that business day without a Social Security number. We will also supply an affidavit, which will go out the next business day. If you go directly to DMDC, they, of course, do not have the ability to hand out affidavits, nor is there anybody to answer the phone. At our organization, someone is always available to answer the phone during business hours, and it's usually a person who's pretty knowledgeable to walk you through any of the one-off problems you might encounter. The DMDC site also goes down very, very often. I would say at times it could be more than 1 or 2 times a day. The advantage to using a service provider is that your request is queued and poised to be acted upon as soon as the site goes back up. And that's all we do. I mean, we're sitting there waiting for the site to go up. We're constantly knocking at the door, so you know that your search is there, holding its place in line and ready to be responded to as soon as the DMDC site goes up. To the right, you see that happens to be our home page, just so that you can see what our operation looks like. The registration is, of course, no charge, and it is only a per name charge for verification. As I mentioned, it's $36.40 for the verification, and an additional $20 if you happen to need an affidavit.
Thank you. Wow, that was a lot of great information. Thank you, Roy. And we have a question. Roy, this is going to be for you. Mark would like to know who is actually covered by this act.
There's a technical aspect to the answer, I'm afraid. I will tell you that on our site there is a blog and an FAQ section which has many, many articles on exactly that question and deals with it in a lot of detail, but I'll try to answer it now. The obvious answer is certainly people who are in the military right now are going to be covered in those 7 agencies. National Guards are also covered under only one circumstance, and that is if the call-up is by the President, not by a governor, and the person's service exceeds 30 days, and his or her salary is paid for by the federal government. So that's what's covered under the SCRA for National Guard. But some states also have coverage for governor call-ups. So you do have to make sure in your local state whether there is that protection too. Reservists are protected as of the date of their call-up orders. So if they're called up to serve and they receive their orders today to report on September 1, they enjoy their coverage right now, not on the date that they report for duty. That's sort of a little bit of an exception. I mentioned before also that people's coverage can extend beyond the termination date of active duty. I will mention, for those of you who deal with foreclosures, the date for protections against foreclosures is a full year, and that is by a special statute which is set to expire at the end of December, when it will revert to 90 days like all the other provisions, unless Congress passes some legislation maintaining that 1-year protection. There are some issues about family members. Family members are not automatically covered under the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act. However, once a matter goes to court, after it's already in court, the family member is entitled to ask the court for protections, and in that case, the court has a very, very broad latitude. The court can determine what is the nature of the obligation, whether the obligation predated active duty, which is usually the touchstone for whether a obligation is covered by the SCRA. Normally, if a service member enters into a contract after he has joined active duty, the SCRA is much, much, much more limited and may or may not even apply. The court, in a request from a family member, may also determine whether if there are any other resources available to the family, and the circumstances around the request. There are no provisions for attorney's fees under SCRA, so it is an expensive proposition for the family to go in and ask for that determination. It's not done often, but the protections are there.
And we have one more question for you, Roy. This is from Sue, and Sue would like to know, does this affidavit only come into play for consumer collections, or is this something I will see on a commercial collector?
Well, the debtor has to be the debtor has to be an individual, first of all, as you had mentioned, Amy. The SCRA does not apply to any business entities, but there is no differentiation between a consumer debt and a commercial debt under SCRA. If you're going to take adverse action against a person who may be covered by SCRA, that's the determining factor of whether the person you're suing is entitled to the protections, not necessarily the nature of the obligation.
Okay. Very good. And that looks like all the questions that we have at this time. But, of course, if you have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to contact us directly.